Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome to the first day of the DigiConnect University Summer School Digital for Our Planet. We welcome you all and 1,000 others that registered. Thank you for registering. Thank you for the interest. In this summer school, we will entertain the two mega trends, digitalization and green transition. Before we get to that, 2 words about the DigiConnect University Summer School and DigiConnect University as seminar organizer. If you want to learn what is happening in digital and you want to know about the latest development in the digitalization, Digital Connect University is the place to go. We have already organized 350 webinars and 5 summer schools, bringing together 150,000 interested participants, disseminating all the latest news. On behalf of the DigiConnect University team, and especially Andrea and the team that made this technically possible, we would welcome you to this 6th edition of Digital Summer School. Here, during the next 2 weeks, you can learn all the latest developments of digitalization and how they can deliver to green transition. And that is not only AI and 5G, Internet of Things and blockchain, but many other things that deal with modeling and simulation, high-performance computing, supercomputing, and how we can understand better the climate change and work on mitigation and adaptation. But don't ask yourself only what digitalization can do for the climate and environment. Let's see also what digitalization benefits from, what sustainability can do for digitalization, pushing the boundary of energy efficiency, pushing the boundaries of material efficiency, because that's where we really need to progress. And these requirements of green transition and all the requirements that our leaders took and say, look, by 2030, we will be minus 55% of the GHG emissions, and by 2050 climate neutral, this poses a lot of constraints on digitalization, which hopefully will also drive innovation and will drive competitiveness of our industries. So now, first day, and every technology and everything that deals with digitalization is underpinned by one thing, and that's data. That's why today, the first session in the first day, of course, will be dedicated to data and how they underpin the Green Deal and the green transition. And who better than Ivo Wollman, our data man, not data man in the sense of Star Trek, but our commission, DigiConnect, and of course is working very carefully now on the Data Act and also going through Parliament and Council with the Data Governance Act. So it's a pleasure for me to again welcome you on behalf of Connect University, the whole team, and giving the floor to the moderator of the session, Ivo Wollman.
Yes, good afternoon. And many thanks, Elias. So I'm Ivo Wollman, I'm here with a very distinguished group of speakers. So Sandra Sarau, Torsten Reitz, and Ulla Kronborg. I will introduce them before their own presentations. Now, this afternoon, we're going to talk about data and the Green Deal. And what I would like to explore in the coming, 15, 20 minutes is how data use and sustainability actually go hand in hand. And therefore we go to the next slide. As Elias mentioned, this twin transition, the 2 top priorities of the European Commission, green and digital. Now, this has given rise to a number of policies, a number of legislative instruments. And of course, the first one was the European Green Deal of December 2019. And already there, the importance of data for sustainability is clearly recognized. Then we've got the European Strategy for Data, February 2020. It's part of the broader policy on digital for Europe. And there's a clear link established between the Green Deal and data, and the commitment to set up a common European Green Deal data space. We will get back to that later. Now, you also see the importance of these areas coming back in how the money is distributed. There is this Recovery and Resilience Fund with a total value of 672 billion euros. And these investments are going to be used to get to a full recovery after the COVID crisis. Now, a minimum of 20% of this fund should be spent on digital. A minimum of 37% should be spent on green. So together, the investments will represent more than 50% of the whole investment amount. Okay, now let me go to the next slide. So why is data so crucial for the green agenda? Well, because data helps us to understand what's happening. It helps us understand and tackle, therefore, the challenges. Data is really essential for fact-based policymaking. It's also crucial for debunking disinformation around the environment and climate change. Let me give some examples, but there are many more. Think about climate change and the need to measure that and the role of data in that. Think about how data can be used to predict disasters that are the result of climate change. Then there is data for the circular economy, the creation of a product passport, for example, or energy consumption. Everything data can do to reduce energy consumption. In the first place, there is the smart grid, optimizing the efficiency of energy distribution, but also actually data can help to make transport more efficient and therefore save energy. Now, also simply by showing the energy consumption in a certain neighborhood, you can ensure that individuals actually lower their energy consumption simply by looking at what the neighbors are doing, and if they're above the consumption level, they will be more careful. We've seen that in several experiments. Okay, going to the next slide. So this is the upside, but you may say, yeah, that's all fine, but actually isn't data part of the problem and the energy consumption of data itself and the use of data? Well, you're right. In 2018, data centers accounted for 2.7% of the electricity demand in the EU. And the efficiency of the infrastructures is actually improving, but still the current energy consumption due to data use could increase if nothing is done. Also there, you see that there is a lot of capacity that is taken up by what we call dark data. Now that sounds a bit sinister, dark data, but actually it's not that sinister. It's all the data that is held by organizations and that is never used. So there must be a more efficient way of handling these energy consumers. Now, within our funding programs, we are working very hard to make sure that there will be highly energy efficient and sustainable data infrastructures, and also the deployment of these infrastructures is one of the areas that we're looking at in our policies and our funding. Let's go to the next slide. So data, it has an enormous potential, but this potential is currently underused. Actually, less than 1% of the unstructured data is actually analyzed and used at the moment. And only 50% of the data that is consciously captured to be used is actually never used, let alone reused for other purposes. Then you see other issues that require better governance of data. 70% of employees have access to data that they're actually not supposed to see. That's quite a lot. And another thing, it's not so easy to make use of the data, even if you have the data. 80% of the time of data analysts is spent on the discovery and the cleaning of the data, making it usable together with other data. That's quite a lot. So can that be made more efficient? Now, that brings me to the data strategy on the next slide. It was adopted by the European Commission in 2020, and of course, there is these issues with data use that I mentioned, but first I would like to mention that the benefits of data use, they go beyond the sustainability question, of course. They will help us live longer and healthier lives. You can see what data meant during the COVID crisis and how data has actually informed the policies about being stricter or less strict in terms of confinements or not. Data will help us to move around easier across cities or across countries. And then there's, of course, the economic aspects. Data is a prime material for new economic activities. It's a basis for innovative products and services. And data is also a source of efficiency gains for all companies across the whole economy. That's why we have this European strategy for data. There will be more data available. There will be new technologies to exploit it. And what we would like to do is to create a real single market for data. It's a space where data can flow between countries and between sectors, where there is a lot of high quality data available to create and innovate, where data is used in full respect of European values and European rules, for example, on data protection. This is really important. And then last but not least, where there are clear rules for the access and use of the data, rules that are fair and that are also practical. And only then, if we manage to set up such a framework, we will benefit from the second wave of data that will be industrial data that is going to be a basis for a lot of the innovation that will come around in the coming decades. Now, this European strategy, we are deploying this through 4 pillars, and you will see that on the next slide. And the first pillar is actually a cross-sectoral governance framework. It's about the legislative framework for data. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Then we also work with investments through our funding programs, but also in combination what I mentioned before, the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So there, what we'd like to have in place is a strong European data infrastructure that underpins the development of the data economy. A third pillar is about competences. This is in general about data literacy, make sure that everyone can handle data, but it's also about ensuring that we have the right workforce in place, the top people around data that make the difference for research and implementation of data tools throughout the economy. And last but not least, there is the rollout of common European data spaces. I'll come back to the common European data spaces in a separate slide. Let me first have a look at the 4 key instruments, legislative instruments that were presented in this European strategy for data in the next slide. So the Commission made a proposal for a Data Governance Act. That's about ensuring trust in data sharing by regulating organizations that bring the demand and the supply of data together, the data intermediaries. In this context, I would also like to mention the Digital Market Act that the Commission proposed in December of 2020. That's about regulating market power of gatekeepers. That is based, amongst other things, on the use of data, leveraging the potential of data across different sectors. Then a third instrument that's still in the making is an implementing act on high-value data sets. It's based on the Open Data Directive that was adopted in 2019, or it was modified in 2019. And this Open Data Directive gives the Commission the possibility to adopt an implementing act with a list of high-value data sets. It's data sets that have a particularly high potential from an economic and societal point of view. And one of the categories of data sets that we have to look into as European Commission is actually the category of environmental data. And a consequence of being on the list of high-value data sets means that the data sets will be available for free. in machine readable format and through API. So that's ideal material for artificial intelligence. Now, then there is a last instrument we are working on, which is the Data Act. And the goal of the Data Act is to make sure that the value of data that's created is actually distributed fairly over the different actors in the data economy. Think about a smart device that you buy. You have a smart fridge. Is it your data, or is it actually the data of the manufacturer? Or should it be of both of you? And who is going to benefit from this kind of data? Or should it be for the aftermarket actually to benefit? Now, it's that kind of questions we look at in the Data Act. One remark I would still like to make on the high-value data sets and the Open Data Directive. Of course, there is a very strong link there with the Inspire Directive that has laid the basis for harmonizing the data sets that are collected, geospatial data sets that are collected for the benefit of improving the environment. And the other speakers are going to talk about that later on. Now, the Common European Data Spaces, a few words on that. When we realized, and that's the next slide, when we were writing the data strategy, we realized that different sectors are actually quite different and require different approaches. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach across the economy. So that's why we invented this concept of data spaces, sectoral data spaces. And what is a data space? Well, a data space is actually the combination of data infrastructures and governance structures. And only the combination of the two is going to make things move truly. And one of the data spaces that have been announced is the environmental, the Green Deal data space. A risk there is that when you work with data spaces that you create new silos. And of course, we have to avoid that. And we have to make sure that there are bridges between the data spaces so you don't get new silos because you take this sectoral approach. Now, we're using the funding programs, including the digital program, to kickstart these data spaces. On the next slide, I've got a quite interesting example, an exciting example of what we do with the funding. Now, this will get further attention in the session tomorrow afternoon, so I won't go too much into the detail. The colleagues are going to deal with that tomorrow. But this Destination Earth project, it's going to improve Europe's abilities to predict extreme weather patterns, amongst other things. And it's done by building a digital model of the Earth, and that's going to be built on digital twins. What are digital twins? Well, actually, there are digital replicas of various aspects of the Earth system. So these replicas will allow you to model and see what happens if. Now, these twins are going to offer high quality information and services and models that will allow you to do forecasts and visualizations, and that will help us to deal with climate change and also to monitor what's happening and actually make changes that are necessary. So the first two digital twins are to be launched in 2023, and the access to these digital twins is going to be tailored to both experts and non-experts. Okay, I've got a few minutes left, so my two last slides. First one is about what's next. Well, actually, there's many exciting things that are coming up in the coming year on data and sustainability. Let me give you some of the elements. Well, first of all, I mentioned it already. There's the Data Act, foreseen for Q4 2021. That's not only going to deal with business-to-business data sharing and things like the consumer objects, smart consumer objects that I talked about, but also it's going to be about business-to-government data sharing. How can governments better use for the common good certain data produced and held by the private sector? And of course, I already mentioned the high-value data sets under the Open Data Directive. Now, then there's the whole package of funding, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, the digital program, Horizon Europe, CEF to digital, all of that is going to be launched. Now, in these programs, you see that data is everywhere, green is everywhere, so let's make sure that the two are properly combined. Then, the elaboration of the Common European Green Deal data space. Now, the Commission is going to report on where we stand with the different data spaces, and of course, the European Green Deal data space is one of the key ones there. Inspire, we will hear more about that from the colleagues who are going to talk after me. And the last aspect of data I would like to mention is environmental reporting. That's more and more important. It's also about data at the end of the day. And there, the non-financial reporting directive is being revised. There's a proposal on the table made by the Commission for a corporate sustainability reporting directive that was proposed in April 2021. And then the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, also very relevant, is fully applicable since March 2021. It will allow you to know as an investor basically how the companies you invest in are dealing with questions of sustainability. I get to my conclusion, the last slide. Now, data use is essential for the green transition. Let's make the most out of that. Now, with the European Strategy for Data that came out last year, we are putting the structures in place, the legislation in place to make sure that Europe can be at the forefront in the data economy. And of course, we support that with the funding programs. So it's a typical case where the policy development, legislation, and funding all go hand in hand and go in the same direction. Now, I would say, let's work together, all of us, companies, consumers, academics, policymakers, to make the most out of the combination of data and green, because there is a fantastic potential there that we have to grasp. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking whether there's already a question in the chat, but I don't see any question at the moment. So then I propose that we go on to the next. When will the Common European Green Deal data space be launched? Well, there will be specific funding in the Digital Europe program to orchestrate the launch of this Common European Green Deal data space. But actually, the subspaces of this Common European Green Deal data space are already under construction. And they are already being built. So we're going to report as European Commission on what's the progress on the different data spaces and the subspaces that have been announced in the 2020 data communication. And then another question before we move on to the next speaker. To what extent is the available and future data contextualized? Aren't we losing the crucial information when aggregating in common spaces? Okay, let me think what is the question behind this question. So basically, if you take data sets out of their original context, I think that's the idea, aren't you losing crucial contextual information about how the data was collected and why it was collected? Yes, I think that is a good point, and you have to take that into account when using the data, for example, for artificial intelligence purposes. If you use certain data sets that were collected for one purpose in a completely different context, and you let a machine loose on the data sets and let it work on that basis, well, things can go wrong if the data, where it comes from, why it was collected, whether there's a bias or not, is not properly qualified. Having said that, I think that a lot of the potential of data is going to be between different sectors. Think about the potential of environmental data for the health sector to see how the environmental conditions are actually affecting the health of people. To combine this kind of information with aggregated data about how certain treatments work on certain people, then individualize that and actually make sure that treatments are suitable for this specific person. So I think that is really a big future, the cross-fertilization of data from the different sectors. But the point that is being made is absolutely right. You can never just take data from one context and without thinking about that context, transplant it into another context. And that needs to be taken into account properly in terms of the quality of the data. Okay, I think I'm moving on to the next presentation. There will, at the end of all the presentations and after the specific questions for the last presentation, there will be about 20 minutes to actually have further questions and a further question and answer session. Okay, then I'm very happy to introduce to you now Sandra Sarau. She's going to talk about incentivizing sustainability. That is very promising. Now, Sandra is head of sustainability at Bolt, and Bolt, many of you will know the company. It's the leading European mobility platform. And before moving to Bolt, Sandra served as Global Affairs Director in the Estonian government. And she was working with in the CIO office of Estonia. If that's not enough, she is also lecturing at Tallinn University on the topics of the legal framework of e-governance and EU law. Sandra, the floor is yours for about 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. Can you see my presentation and hear me well?
Definitely.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for this kind introduction. And I'm actually wearing the Estonian presidency scarf from when I was still working for the Estonian government. And I'm so glad you mentioned during, I think, only one of the slides, the free flow of data regulation, because this was something that the Estonian government during our presidency really pushed for. And at the time, we were really trying to find use cases where it is that public sector could win from private sector data that is not being shared with them, albeit it could have been shared with them. And then I moved on to Bolt, which you kindly introduced, and I see there are so many use cases where actually private sector would like to share data, but not necessarily the public sector wants to get access to this data. But I'm going to explain a bit about this in details. So in the next 19 minutes now or so, I would just describe what Bolt is doing in terms of sustainability and how we can exploit the data to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. Firstly, a bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with Bolt, though it was mentioned. We are an Estonian mobility platform, which was launched in 2013. Our CEO at the time was only 19 years old. And he started the company with the cash he convinced his parents to give him, which was meant for his university degree. But then he so much believed in this endeavor that he managed to convince them to give him the money to start the company instead. And now you might say that the parents are doing quite well. In any case, Bolt started off in Estonia. We expanded to a few CEE markets quite quickly. And today we're in about 40 countries and 200 cities globally. But our focus market is Europe and Africa. So in European Union, we're in all of those markets where it's allowed or it's accessible to access the market as a mobility platform. Some of you may have noticed from time to time, there are some new rules in place in some of the capitals of Europe that concern the ride-hailing service. And also these days, one of the services that Bolt offers is e-scooters, and this aspect is also being more and more regulated. Why only these two continents and these two markets? We are a bit in Southeast East Asia now as well as in Latin America. But Bolt has a very frugal mindset, which is a very Estonian way. So we say we like to do more with less. So we access only those markets where we know we can be the market contender or we can win the market. And we're not going to go somewhere to burn money to win market access. This is not Bolt's attitude. And as mentioned, Bolt is currently in 40 plus countries in more than 200 cities. And with only a team of 2,000 people, we actually serve 50 million passengers, and we have more than 1.5 million drivers and carriers globally. So this is pretty big for a small company coming from Estonia. So now, why am I here today? Why are we talking about sustainability and data? Here's just a slide for you. I mean, I don't know if you remember the taxi market, let's say maybe 5-6 years ago, or in many Western European markets, still the taxi market is more of a traditional market, and the platforms have less to do with the daily transport. But in many markets across the CEE, we say that already now, ride-hailing has significantly reduced congestion. And of course, when we talk about this, we talk about data. I mentioned that Bolt has 1.5 million drivers globally and more than 50 million customers globally. So how do we know what services should we offer to those customers is, of course, through data. We have generated unique data sets over 7 years, and all the new services that Bolt launches are based on exactly what can we do to serve our customers better and actually to take the pressure off of the environment. So many of you have probably sat in a congestion or in a traffic jam, and many of you still do. I've now sold my car. I solely use Bolt services, and I do not get them for free. So normally what I do is take a combination of public transport and a scooter to get to the office. But these days, of course, everyone works from home. So traffic jams or congestion is something that is not familiar to me, but this is not the case with each and every one of you here. And many of you take a car to the office. According to Bolt's data, which comes from more than 40 countries around the world, cars stand in the parking lot about 95% of the time, which means it is completely sitting idle. You don't have anything to do with the car. Those cars take up a lot of city space, so space from parks, from playgrounds, and in many cities we have more than 8 parking lots per one car. It's roughly 130 square meters of room, which is almost twice the size of my apartment. So just for parking your car in a city. How is this the most efficient way of moving around in a city if you just move in a vehicle that is used 5% of the time? Well, according to what Bolt sees, it is not the most efficient way of moving around. And furthermore, of course, we have to take into account their health. 20% of the world's CO2 emissions are actually created by road transport. So this considers pollution, affects the air that we actually breathe in, as well as how much exercise do we get. So if you go with public transport, you take a walk, you take a public transport means maybe a scooter. If you sit in a car, you get to the end destination, sit probably in a traffic jam. Again, not the most efficient way of moving around. So what Bolt started considering was that while we mitigate those trips for 50 million users, Bolt does not own any cars, but we know what are people's mobility behaviors, who goes to where, how long or short are the distances that people take with our services, what are they willing to pay for those services, etc. So thus we realized we have quite a big of impact and how we can actually influence how the people switch and use different types of services. So we laid down our sustainability plan, of course, based on the data that we have on the users. So Bolt's focuses are to help create a shared and sustainable business with creating more zero and low emission options for the users. However, in 2019, we also asked our users, would you be willing to use more sustainable mobility options if available? And then 90% or so of the people said they are willing to use them. And then we asked, would you use more sustainable public transport options if they were more expensive? And then nearly 100% of the users said they wouldn't. So now we had this understanding that people would use more sustainable transport options, but they're not willing to pay more for them. So what we did was we launched new services, such as e-scooters, which are now also on the streets of Brussels and across around 100 cities in Europe. So we wanted to bring alternatives to cars for people who prefer to take something more sustainable. And we have done different model shift pilots on the Bolt platform. So for instance, normally where you have the ride-hailing different categories, such as premium, Bolt category, pets category, assist category, we also inserted for one day walking in there. So we try to convince people to go and walk. And then with the scooters for modal shift, we insert the scooter category. And basically we see how many people then switch from taking a car for short distant trips to taking a scooter, which is not only more sustainable, but a lot cheaper for the customer as well. And in many European cities, including the Scandinavian cities, especially in Sweden, we saw that 12% of the people moved permanently from ride-hailing to scooters, so for trips under 5 kilometers. So this already shows that people are willing to use alternative methods if available. In summer capital of Estonia, which is my home country and actually also my hometown, we saw that more than 35% of the people actually switched for basically every ride from cars to scooters. So we already have this massive data set that we have around users and their trends of moving around. And so we realized, okay, we can bring more alternatives to public transport, more alternatives to personal cars and to complement public transport to our platform. Then we introduced car sharing, which is just short-term car rentals. So the idea is that people would switch, at least wouldn't buy their second car, and they would use a Bolt service or a combination of Bolt services. And I have a slide on this upcoming as well, instead of buying the second car for the family, because we do understand that perhaps this first car is needed if you have kids and if you need to take them around the city all the time. Then what also Bolt works on is mitigating our existing footprint. So of course, in order to realize what is our footprint, we needed to calculate all of the car emissions that we have on our transport platform. We verified those calculations based on the car emissions, and then Bolt has started doing offsetting. We also use green offices, and of course, when this discussion today is about data and energy availability and these sorts of things, and actually in many markets, it's quite difficult to access green electricity. And then we also work on educational and showing leadership activities. And for instance, Bolt has paired up with cities, and this is important for the discussion I mentioned about free flow of data, to share the data that Bolt has uniquely on the platform. So Bolt has on one platform ride-hailing, e-scooters, e-bikes, car sharing, meaning short-term rental, as well as Bolt food. So basically, we have this very unique data set on how people move around in the city, or where do they need to access their things from. And we have offered this quite unique data set in many cities across Europe. And believe it or not, many cities don't want access to this data. One of the European capitals said they don't want this data because they already get data from how users move around in the city from a telecoms company. Our data set is quite different from what the telecoms company can offer. And I mentioned to you that we are very happy and willing to share such data, but it's not always the case that the cities want to get access to this data, probably because they don't know how to deal with this data. And there should be more data stewards in all of the public sector offices, including in cities. So this is what I just talked about. What Bolt tries to do is challenge the personal car, and precisely not take away users from public transport, but complement public transport with our own services, and to take people away from their private cars. So we have all this data access on users, how they like to move around in a city. Who would need to take a trip that is 1 to 4 or 3 kilometers? You would take an e-scooter. For a longer trip, we can recommend you an e-bike. For even longer trip, you can take a ride-hailing, which is basically a platform taxi, or then a car rental if you need to transport several people or your own goods and need to have a hold of the car for a few days. And in an ideal world, we could also share this data, how people move in the city, with the cities, and show them, okay, your public transport spot should be 2 kilometers or 1 kilometer this way or that way, because we see that people often enter trips near this. They don't choose public transport option because they see that the public transport spot is a bit further away than necessary. And this way we actually could show them that you should expand your public transport network, or public transport stops at midnight. We see that most of the trips take place between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. So if they would extend the public transport service for 1 hour, they could actually get more people to use public transport. In many places, in many cities, the problem is that public transport is very much city center focused. So if you would need in a city from point A to point B, you would probably need to go through city center, even if this is not on the way. So this is clearly not efficient for users. So we get those customers and we see that which way they would prefer to move. And all this data is something we could share with public sector, with the cities, so they could optimize their public transport. Furthermore, based on the data that we have and based on how to make mobility more sustainable, one of the key aspects is, of course, electrification of fleets. So how do you bring more electric cars to the platform for lower emissions on your trips? So some of the takeaways that we could share with you based on how our taxi drivers, our couriers, as well as users move, is that charging infrastructure is not deployed consistently throughout the EU. And this is, again, something where Bolt could share data. We could say, these are the main places where drivers go to tank their gas for their ICE, internal combustion engine cars. This is what they would use for electric vehicle charging if they would have access to those. Because with the unique data set that we have in 18, 19 European Union countries and 40 countries globally, we could provide very helpful data sets on where the charging stations should be placed. We also see that drivers, they fear that they may not have access to a charging station. Many of the drivers live in suburban areas. So currently the charging stations for EVs are located within the cities or in the main hotspots that either the gas stations, which provide electric charging, or the public sector, which deploys the charging stations, sees fit. But actually, since the drivers live in suburban areas, we see that the charging station should also be applied in those suburban areas to all of the blocks of apartments there. And not necessarily this is the first case where you think where to put or install an EV charging station. And of course, we see there is lack of second-hand market for EVs, which is a very problematic for drivers who own their own cars. I mean, I mentioned that Bolt has 1.5 million drivers globally, but we do not own any cars. All the drivers own their own cars, so if they need to purchase a car in order to lower the footprint, currently due to limited subsidies, very low support from governments to purchase those cars, as well as limited second-hand market because those cars are cheaper, the drivers do not switch from their regular cars to EVs, because while the maintenance cost is lower, actually the initial purchasing price is higher. And that's why those people don't want to switch to those cars. And what do we see as opportunities? So one of the things definitely would be mandatory national targets to tackle the fragmented charging infrastructure. So I come from Estonia. I'm from Tallinn, which is, in terms of digitalization, normally seen as an advanced place. However, when it comes to EV infrastructure, at least this fall or this winter, Estonia had only 4 ultra-fast charging stations for electric vehicles, which is clearly not enough to bring sustainable mobility onto the streets. And again, this is where Bolt could help. Bolt, as well as other transport operators who we pair up with, and to show where it would be most efficient and most useful to have those charging spaces available. In terms of subsidies, I mentioned that Bolt is a ride-hailing company, but the ride-hailing companies from road transport, they constitute about 20% of the cars. However, they make 40% of the mileage. And this way, if those subsidies could focus on high-kilometer use cases, such as ride-hailing, then actually this means we could get a lot less emissions done by ride-hailing companies because those cars would appear on the streets much faster. Then I also mentioned that we would really need fast and easy installation of charging points in all buildings, not only with new buildings. And again, this is a place where Bolt and other companies could share data in terms of where a number of taxi drivers live or start their trips, or where would they need those charging stations. And then, of course, Estonia is not the country here, unfortunately, but in many countries, there are already very strict CO2 standards in terms of where cars have access to the cities, where the congestion is higher, as well as perhaps limited areas of access in the cities. So Bolt has very unique data sets on what type of cars produce what type of emissions, how limiting certain types of cars could help create those lower emission zones, and Bolt would be very happy to share this data as well. And then I think I have about 2 minutes left. What I just wanted to say and show to you is that the future of sustainable transport is database and shared. So this is a type of a chart that we like to show, and this would show what type of vehicles people prefer to use to get access to their work, to their offices, to their children's schools, etc. And this is basically all the type of data that currently Bolt possesses. And we would help and share this data to make the future more sustainable. And you can see public transport is integrated into here as well. So the future of sustainable mobility is not taking away people from public transport, but rather distributing the share and demand-based data with public transport to help public transport advance itself to make more optimized routes with the help of data coming from the private sector. Because if the cities don't get access from such unique players such as Bolt is, then it's very difficult for them to produce this own type of data sets or to understand how this data works. So the future is multimodal, and only this way we can be fully sustainable. I think I have 1 minute left, and then I would just quickly introduce the Bolt team, which today is 2,200 people. From 50 different nationalities. In our HQ in Tallinn, we have 700 people from more than 40 nationalities. And if some of you are interested in us, then just look at our careers website and join us at Bolt. I think I was right on time, right?
Absolutely, you're perfect, Sandra. So, and take a breath because there are some questions came in. And let's take 2 or 3 now. One question is about the data that you have, whether it's actually completely open for everyone. Could it be? Where can you access it then? And if it's not completely open, what apart from policy demands could make you open up the data more and more in general, not just Bolt but businesses? What are your considerations there?
Yeah, it's a very good question, but unfortunately, no, our data cannot be in the public domain, specifically because our data is our business. So the routes that our users take, how many drivers we have precisely per one country, all this is confidential business information, and this is what differentiates us from our competitors. And this is the reason, unfortunately, why it cannot be in the public domain. But the cities with whom we would like to share the data, we do NDAs or MOUs to share this data, and we hope that cities keep this data in confidence.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And then a second question, it's around the concept of the 15-minute city, so that most needs should be satisfied within 15 minutes, walk, bike ride, etc. Right? Does that affect at all the Bolt model?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something we have been very interested in. We are thinking that a 20-minute city is a bit more optimal than a 15-minute one. But, you know, in an ideal world, then people would get to access the services that they need within 15-minute bike ride, scooter ride, and would be very much happy to make scooters available in such 15-20-minute areas. In a way that people then wouldn't do still those 1-2 kilometer trips with a car, but rather would use much more sustainable mobility options. Because we see that a car, even an electric vehicle, is not the most optimal way of moving around. Precisely what I showed you at the beginning, a car still needs a parking spot, and it sits there 95% of the time. So the smaller the vehicle, actually the less space we take away from the city and from the citizens, and hence the smaller shared vehicles are precisely what fit into this 15-20 minute city concept.
Okay, no, thanks a lot. And then we do a quick question, and it's a challenging one. So it's about it's about the mobility platforms, right? They make unsustainable urban mobility a bit better. That's what the question says. And doesn't that actually undermine more revolutionary models like free public transport? We now have got free public transport in Luxembourg, and I got quite attached to that. So how do you see that interaction?
We have free public transportation in Tallinn as well, but we see that public transport and such mobility options should complement each other, precisely because public transport is not always available. And we see the cases, especially with suburban areas. For instance, I mean, Tallinn is not that big. It's 400,000 people, but every day 60,000 cars come from suburban areas to city center because the public transport doesn't move across the city borders very effectively. So there we see that precisely the ride hailing or short-term car rental, car sharing could perfectly complement public transport because Tallinn has those park and ride zones. So you come in from the city border with a shared mobility option, and then you go on from there with public transport where you need to go to the city center. So precisely this this combination of both is an ideal world.
Okay, many thanks for that, Sandra. And then I think it's time to move on to the next presentation, where we've got Torsten Reitz. And you're going to talk about from the Inspire Directive to high impact green data ecosystems. So sounds also very exciting. Now, Torsten, you are the co-founder and CEO of WeTransform. I suppose you will explain exactly what WeTransform is doing to us. And you've been involved as a project manager or data harmonization expert in more than 100 projects. That's quite impressive. And there was a question in the chat about the interoperability of data and how that's being taken into account. And I think you will talk to that. Now, before joining WeTransform, you worked at Fraunhofer as a scientist and department head. And from 2012 to 2015, you worked as a product engineering lead at the S3 R&D Center in Zurich, right? Wow. Okay, that's quite a career. So please, yes, WeTransform, and let's see what you're transforming and how.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And yeah, you actually also took a little bit of the message that I wanted to start with in the beginning of your presentation. And yeah, I think for me, the key of why we are discussing what we can do with data is actually that observation can lead to change. And when we observe something, that's how we generate data that hopefully then can support what we should actually be doing. Why that's so important today is something that I want to touch upon briefly. If we go back like 50 or 60 years even, it was very, very clear to most citizens that there were environmental issues. So they were usually very, very local. Like when the creek behind your house is so poisonous that the kids should not get close to that at all, or when the birds basically just die, or when the air pollution looks like this, it's pretty clear that there are environmental issues and they are understandable and they are direct. And yeah, so in that period also actually environmental legislation became one of the key activities of the European Union and its predecessors. So that started with the Birds Directive in 1978, which is exactly the year that I was born in. So this basically followed me my whole life. We had the Habitats Directive, air quality, water framework, and environmental noise, to name just a few. There's actually far more, of course. Somehow I decided to keep it to the directives. And many of these were actually very, very successful. Yeah, some of the problems that were addressed through these are basically gone at this point, or we at least have very good mechanisms in place to react to them and to have continuous improvement. Yeah, however, nowadays we actually fight with problems that seem to be a little bit less transparent. Like it's not as easy to actually see NOx, and not everybody has a glacier in their backyard that they can see recede every season, like this one. The Morteratsch Glacier in Switzerland. So things like climate change and other global problems are inherently more complex and also more difficult to understand. And so our observations become less direct and more long-term and indirect through collecting and aggregating large amounts of data. And that's kind of typical for all kinds of problems that we're seeing. And it's very hard for I would say, most people. Like one very recent example is this, that I'm not sure how it was in all the places across Europe that are listening to this now, but in Germany in particular, this spring was actually rather cold and wet compared to the years before. So as you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, we had average temperatures which were between 3 and 2 degrees colder than the long-term average of the last 30 years. And of course, that means that we now have a small perspective on both spatial and temporal dimensions compared to what's happening globally. And globally, the trend is really clear. So we are seeing a strong rise of temperatures basically from decade to decade. And at the same time, that strong rise in many regions is actually 1 or 2 degrees. And people basically say, okay, what's 1 or 2 degrees? They have a hard time understanding what that abstract number really means, because to them in weather, it doesn't really make a difference. Yeah, this is not unique to climate change. It's the same on basically all kinds of large scale trends that happen over long times. One of my favorite examples comes from Hans and Ola Rosting, who worked on, among other things, the Factfulness book. And they described that if you ask people nowadays to make an estimate how many people still live in extreme poverty, they'll tend to make a far too high estimate, like 50% or at least 30% or things like that. Whereas in reality, the number has been going down from about 85% 200 years ago to around 8 to 9% nowadays. And of course, there's still a lot to do. There are still a lot of people living in poverty and extreme poverty. But on the other hand, the large scale trend in this case is actually very positive. Yeah, so what can we do now basically to proceed with environmental policy and generally as a society to really understand what's going on? And what role can data visibility play there? Well, this is a question that's also not entirely new. And within the European Union, in addition to having the policies on actually protecting the environment, there has also been a lot of data-based legislation. One of these pieces, and that's the one that I've been mostly involved with, is the Inspire Directive, which is basically about making spatial and especially environmental data accessible and usable. And it's basically split up into 3 areas. One is what could be called basic geographical reference data. So these are things like administrative units, so basically the borders and so on, geographical names, addresses, transport networks like railway and roads and so on, but also things like protected sites already. Then there is the Annex 2, which is basically what's called coverages, so things that describe the whole surface of the continent, in this case, like the elevation model, land cover, geology, etc. And then there's Annex 3, where a lot of the actual observations go, where a lot of the data that really describes the state of the nature and of everything related is like soil, for example, that's a very important one, or species distribution and habitats and biotopes, and many others. Now, this Inspire Directive has had quite a timeline. As you saw, it initially came into force into 2007, and then there was a 2-year transposition period where it was basically moved to national laws. And then there was a total of a 12-year implementation period, and we happen to be pretty much at the tail end of that now. And this is a bit simplified compared to the actual timeline, but I've basically split it up into 3 parts across the 3 annexes. So again, basic data, coverages, and the detailed information on the environment. And there are 3 phases: identifying and describing what resources, what digital resources fall under the directive, initially making it accessible via APIs, and then harmonizing the content so that it's actually usable as one big resource, really. Yeah, and the deadline, the last big deadline, is actually this year, but most of the work is supposed to have been done by the end of last year, which is why this block ends in 2020. And if we compare that to the actual state, we can see that the first part, identifying and describing, has been completed for the majority of data sets. It's a bit hard to assess that because there's also some invisible data still. Maybe it's the dark data that was mentioned earlier. I really like that term. There's also about 40 to 50% of data sets that are now accessible. That means people can, in principle, if they have the right to do so, access the data through an API. And we think that right now there's a little bit more than 20% of data sets are actually already harmonized. and a little bit less than that are fully compliant. So yeah, there's still a little bit to do. As you can see, full compliance is true maybe today for a fifth of all the data sets that are relevant, and we expect lots of work is still needed. So is Inspire useful already? That's a question that I actually get asked quite a lot. And now there are quite different views. You have to know that Inspire has been going on for quite a long time, and it's actually not been a very easy ride. So there are tens of thousands of people involved and organizations, and they all have different ideas and policy objectives and so on. But given that kind of complex organizational context and the many themes and so on that have been addressed, quite a lot has happened already. Like I said before, a lot of the data sets are now at least accessible. Yeah, I can find via the GeoPortal and other resources that there is in fact a data set like the one that I'm looking for. Many of them have been harmonized. That means that they are interoperable and that I can actually start with them. And I can tell you it's often infinitely easier to start from an Inspire data set that is already harmonized and for which I actually have documentation and so on, compared to what was usually the state before, where I would just get some proprietary file format and completely no documentation or some documentation that is in a language that I have a hard time translating, etc. So we do see quite some progress. And a bit of the data is also already quite useful, i.e. it is really being applied to different scenarios. So just as an example, the services that we operate within the Inspire infrastructure currently see up to 150 million requests per month. Yeah, there's of course some data sets that get a lot of attention and some that are kind of the seller children, you could say, but that's kind of usual in any kind of digital infrastructure. Yeah, so that having said, so what do we actually do? Yeah, as we transform, we kind of see our role really as being an organization that helps Inspire across the finish line. I mentioned it before, Inspire did have its kind of set of challenges, both technical and organizational. And our goal was always to make the contribution to an open infrastructure like Inspire as easy as possible, as cost effective as possible. And nowadays we work with about 1,100 organizations all across, well, not all across Europe, but across, I think, 12 or 13 countries right now, of which many are national agencies, but of course, there's also a lot of municipalities that need to do that. Yeah, and maybe one thing that I would want to briefly explain is how we actually did that. I said that our objective was to make contributing to an open platform to harmonizing data as easy as possible. That was also what drove my research at Fraunhofer first and foremost many years ago. I wanted to make sure that if many people need to bring data from a lot of different sources, they can do that as effectively and easily as possible. For that, we developed an open source tool called Hail Studio, which really helps with this particular process and makes data harmonization much easier and quicker. The second part is then taking these data sets and actually publishing them as APIs, as services, for which we've developed a fully automated publishing process that also helps to really make all these different compliance rules that exist easier to manage. Yeah, and then about the usefulness part of something that we are now developing is to make sure that all this harmonized data is then also automatically brought into forms that are really easy to use, be it for like a GIS analyst or for an AI framework. So maybe just to quickly look at what did we learn from that implementation. So it was already mentioned, I was involved in a lot of Inspire and data harmonization implementation projects over the last 15 years. And about 70% of these projects actually were around Inspire. And there were quite a few things that we did learn from implementing the directive. And I tried to put this into this kind of SWOT analysis format. So basically internal factors, that's the strengths and weaknesses, and external factors, that's threats and opportunities. Yeah, for the strengths, let's start with that. So one really, really big benefit is that we now have a set of standards that are applicable for these 34 themes that we saw and that are really well detailed and that have well-defined quality criteria. And for these, there is already a very large number of harmonized resources. So it's basically, we've tried this out. We know kind of where the strengths and weaknesses of the specification are and how to do it. And compared to the situation before, like I said, this is really quite an improvement. There is also quite a bit of initial uptake. So we keep hearing some places have other experiences, but all in all, when the data is available and integrated into data flows, people just start using it and nobody asks about it anymore. What I also consider really a strength of Inspire is that there is a committed core community of people who continuously work on enhancing Inspire and really try to help move things forward. Now, sometimes that kind of collides with the first of the weaknesses and the fact that there is a slow technical maintenance process. So all these standards, the technical guidance is what they are called, of course, also need to evolve over long periods of time. And that's still a bit slow. A big problem in Inspire in particular was that the question, what is actually then compliant to the technical guidance, was answered very, very late and is in part still being answered. So whenever, let's say, a new directive or something like that comes across, I think there should be really a lot of attention paid to making sure that that's understandable early on. Another area that probably led to the most discussion was that there is quite a bit of unnecessary complexity in some of the requirements, or things that add little value but actually make implementation more expensive. Yeah, and then there's, of course, that you always find gaps in the specifications. Like, for example, in a lot of the themes, there are no code lists that could be used by everybody. Of course, there are also opportunities. In particular, one of them was already mentioned, and that's synergies with other directives related to data, like the open data or PSI directives. We do also see that there is quite an uptake of services and APIs that are provided. So there is a lot of interest in actually using that, and people are basically just waiting for it to become more complete. There's also a lot of opportunities and synergies with more local or national initiatives. So it doesn't just have to be this abstract thing that's flying over Europe, but quite often you can easily tie in your regional initiatives to have better data exchange and digitalization with something like Inspire. Yeah, and of course, the transition to data space is also a major opportunity, and I'll come to that in a moment. There's also a couple of threads. I was very happy to hear before that the whole topic of data usage conditions and licensing is a big one, because that tends to be one of really the critical questions. In my experience, a lot of public authorities are actually unable to answer questions about how their data could be licensed for different cases, and that often becomes a blocker. Yeah, other than that, there's still often low political or organizational priority for Inspire, so that tends to be an issue. And yeah, also often a mismatch to existing technical stacks that again means that people have less acceptance for implementing Inspire. Yeah, so like I said, now there's a transition period. So we do have this objective of building the Green Deal data space. And now the question is, of course, what will happen with Inspire? How does that actually transition to become part of this Green Deal data space? And we've heard already before, interoperable data is really essential for implementing policy, but also for many other things, like for new startups and so on. And we want to kind of see how we can move forward from what we have now. Very briefly, touching on the data spaces, since that was mentioned already. Yeah, as mentioned, accessible and interoperable data are really core. And now we want to basically organize this in data spaces and subspaces. And then around these, to actually maintain them and have them become really effective, we want to make sure that effective ecosystems form around these. And of course, there's the Green Deal data space, and Inspire is, however, also to some degree relevant for mobility and agriculture, but I won't touch so much on those now. So let's say we want to enable such data ecosystems around the data spaces. So what do we typically need for that? And in our experience, you will need different stakeholder groups who all need to get value, again, in a balanced way from that ecosystem. For the data providers, it typically means they need to have low hurdles of entrance. They need to be able to harmonize and bring their data in really easily at low effort and cost. And then they are willing to do that usually. On the other side, we have, of course, the users. They want to have data that's really useful for their use case. And that can be challenging, especially when it's been collected for quite different cases originally. Users also tend to benefit from network effects. So when there are many users and who've already used the data for similar cases and so on, and can share their solutions, then there tend to be very quick ramp-ups in terms of the overall usefulness of resources. Our experience has also shown that it tends to be important to have facilitators. That means organizations who want to maximize impacts of certain data sets and who then also work towards engaging active users. This is often policy makers, but it can also be like platform operators, for example. And then, of course, we have open value added value services. So these are companies that basically plug into an ecosystem and provide a wide range of services that can be leveraged through this ecosystem. Let's go to a concrete example. So one that we've been working on quite intensively for about 2 years now, which is creating a data ecosystem for forest transformation. You probably know that a lot of forest stands are currently in danger because the climate change has basically reduced their fitness dramatically. And for example, in Germany, we expect about 80 to 90% of all forest stands to be in danger until the end of this century. So many of them will have to be managed actively and probably transformed. Here, the data providers are the surveillancing agencies, forest research orgs, remote sensing companies. The facilitators in this case are, for example, forest research organizations who have noted this problem and they know well about that, as well as environmental agencies. On the user side, we have the forest owners, state forest management organizations, municipal forests. That's just the numbers for Germany, by the way. And so there's a lot of people who actually would benefit from having a broad data set available. And here's also some more examples for added value services like tree seed providers or field logging tools, or if you just want to rent a couple of chainsaws, etc., those could also be integrated. Yeah, there's of course also a business model to deal with that. I mentioned that there should be a balanced value capture, and in this case, there's basically a role for each one of these. So for example, the facilitator makes sure that the pool is actually operated because they want maximum impact. The data providers often have to make their data accessible according to legally mandated standards like Inspire. The users want decision support. Do they need to do something? What should they be doing? And the value-added service providers actually get the kind of leads and interactions and maybe even direct purchases and so on for their services. So let's have a look one level deeper at the actual data space below that. So the goal that we have here is to actually have one big data pool of harmonized data that is relevant for forestry for this particular case. And there's quite a lot of information that we need. And right now, this is super highly fragmented. So every little organization has their own data. And now, especially if they actually want to use AI models or things like that, the results will not be optimal because they have so little data to work with. But what if all the distributed organizations across the different sectors in Europe decide that they pay actually into this pool in a shared way? They bring in their species distribution data, their climate models, protected site information, species, habitats, and so on. So a lot of information, basically. Then we are really looking at a large pool of data that could be used as one. Of course, we still have to take into account the usage conditions. Like, for example, forest owners actually have a lot of sensitive data that would only be possible to use if it's anonymized and aggregated. And so for that, we will have basically filters and processing steps that process the data so that it is, according to the usage conditions, usable in these contexts. And then from that, we get really powerful models that really help, again, the forest owners and others to arrive at good decisions. Yeah, one thing that's of course also often mentioned in this context is the link to digital sovereignty. And when we actually pay the data into such a pool, the pool can actually be distributed. It doesn't have to be one big platform where somebody else really controls the data and then I have little insight into that. Instead, it's possible to basically just keep the data in any level that I want to, like on my own IT center or in some cloud environment, and then provide access to the pool through some form of adapter. And things like that are specified both in the data spaces area and also in the Gaia X architecture. So last step before we conclude is basically, so what can we do with that? So we now have this kind of deep dive into a technical infrastructure, and we actually want to inform a policy discussion. We want to have a public discussion, etc. And for that, with such an infrastructure, we can also create a lot of trust and therefore hopefully transparency. So what data was used, how was it collected, how was it processed, and how was the prediction made? All of these can be answered by an architecture that would take Inspire data, but actually put it into the data spaces. Yeah, and if you're wondering how to get involved into all of that, we will actually start setting up an environmental data community within the International Data Spaces Agency starting this week on Wednesday. So if you're interested in becoming part of that and shaping how data spaces for environmental data could look like, then please reach out to us and join us there. Yeah, and having said that, I'm coming to an end, and yeah, I'm open for your questions.
Yeah, many thanks for that, Thorsten. And indeed, there are a few questions. So one of the questions is, you described Inspire, and it has taken quite some time from 2006 to where we are at the moment. So the question is about the European Green Deal data space. So how long is it going to take to make this data space useful? And I think the underlying question is, can it be a bit quicker than the Inspire process? So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it can actually be much quicker. So what I would expect is that we really use all those resources that have been put into Inspire already and basically transform them to whatever the additional requirements are that the data spaces will bring. From a technical perspective, I think it will be possible to move there quite quickly. Yeah, it's just going to, we actually have to see what the policy process will look like, what the requirements from that side are going to be, and how organizations pick that up. I think that's going to be the largest challenge. But from a technical perspective, I think it will be quite easy and fast to move from resources that are already Inspire compliant to fully working data spaces.
Okay, thanks. And then there was a technical question about the creation of semantic knowledge graphs for environmental data. Could they actually change significantly how we use the data? So how do you see the future for that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Now, I think that basically when we talk about knowledge graphs, it's usually a way to encode our kind of prior knowledge. And then we want to use that in the scope of our analytic and artificial intelligence models and so on. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, sure, we can usually find out new relationships and also very interesting, let's say, causal relationships by kind of letting a model completely just run or train on a large data set. But in the end, to have explainability and to really understand what's going on, I think using more formal structures of knowledge makes a lot of sense. So I kind of see that as an important complementary part to making sense of all the data that we are looking at.
Okay, and then there is a last one before we move on to Ulla. It's a comment about this being critical, that it's critical for all companies, e.g. forestry, to collaborate with the analogy of the Earth's digital twin concept in order to envision future sustainability. So would you agree to that? By the way, I'm not inventing these questions on the spot. This is what's coming in from Slido.
Great, yeah. I fully agree with that. I think the main, if you look at basically how it's happening right now in the world, is that there is a single large platform, like be it a social network or something, and they aggregate a lot of data in a closed environment. And the way that I see that Europe can actually kind of make a counterpoint to that is by doing exactly that, by clearly saying, okay, I am going to put my data in the pool. These are the exact conditions that others can use it or not use it in some parts, like for research or for some analytic cases and so on. That will require a lot of thinking and it will require a lot of collaboration, but I'm very optimistic that in many cases, people will be convinced that like the opportunities of doing so greatly outweigh the challenges.
Okay, many thanks for that.
Welcome.
Then we move on to Ulla Kronborg-Matzeli. And Ulla is going to talk about public sector data, their role and value in a data-driven society, a topic very close to my heart, I must say. So Ulla is Chief Advisor for the Danish Agency for Data Supply and Efficiency. And she's also the National Inspire Contact Point and Danish representative in several EU expert groups. Ulla is chair of the Danish Association for Geographic Information and the International Committee of the Danish Association for Geographic Information, and she also is a lecturer on a freelance basis. Ulla, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Ivo, and thank you for the invitation and the possibility to speak about one of my favorite subjects, data. Data are great. It's a great pleasure to be here in company with all of you following on YouTube. I wish I could see all your faces, and of course in company with the previous speakers. I have a dead presentation. Here we go. That's a long way to Denmark, so maybe there's a delay in the signals. Anyhow, I will briefly take you through public data, why, what, and how, and touch a bit about their value, look into the future role of the public sector, seen in the context of all these EU initiatives that are going to green our economy and get us more data-driven. And I will try to put in a lot of real-life examples just to let you know that I'm not spinning a tale here. But let me start with perspective, because it's all a part of everything is a perspective. And my perspective is the public sector. It's also a member state perspective, and it's also a Danish perspective. So even though I try not to be very biased, and even though I try to look out into the world, you will see that this is my perspective. Also, data is a huge and very broad agenda, so I can only touch upon a little bit about very interesting subjects when you try to unfold data. And just, these are very banal questions, but I came to speak with my daughter the other day. She's a philosopher and therefore not very data trained, but we came to speak about, we use data every day without thinking about it. And I can't see you raise your hands, of course, but I guess that all of you, from the minute you got out of bed until now, you have used data 100,000 times. And you have even generated data, opening mails, Twitter, maybe streaming something, whatever we do. So it is not a false thing to say that data is a resource, just like water. It's not that we think about it every time we turn on the water and get us a glass of water. So it is a resource, and like that, it doesn't do anything on its own. It has to be refined, it has to be worked with in order to unfold its potential and its value. So data, we could say, is a kind of raw material. And then there are many, many types of data, and there are many ways of categorizing them. I mean, from the things you scribble down in your notebook to the zeros and ones in your computer. So data is a lot of things. I speak about them in the context of digital information. Let's have a brief look at public sector just to start on level. Well, we all have a pretty good idea what the public sector is all about. We do organize them differently in different countries in EU, but there are some general conditions that apply to all of the public sectors. One is that they are under the leadership of politicians. It also gives it a democratic issue, but it also means that there's no free play for the public sector, because it's also governed by law, meaning that it is controlled by the same politicians that we have elected, and its main product is actually service to the citizens. While doing this, the public sector collects, administers, and uses a lot of data on a daily basis. They collect data, we collect data. And before digging into how we get hold of all these public sector data, we can all remember the tales we have been, well, they're not tales, but we have been told that every time we interact with a free and do not pay for an internet service, we actually do pay. We do pay with our personal data, because there is no free lunch. But just given the conditions of the public sector, that's not the way we do it. Now, there's a lot of ways of collecting data, and here's just an overview. So registration is a common way of collecting data from the citizens and about the society. For instance, when we move to a new address, we register, and we tell the public sector, I have moved to this new address. When we're hospitalized, it's the same. A lot of data comes from surveying the environment, traffic, weather, whatever the public sector needs to survey in order, for instance, to apply with the environmental directive set by the EU. I will give you an example from my agency. My agency, we make maps. We deal with the spatial information, and we deliver a lot of data to the Inspire directive, as Torsten has just spoken about. But here are some main methods of data collection: satellites, aerial photography, laser scanning, drones, and then of course the registration. Registration could be that the municipalities are telling state government, us, that they have built a new road, which is called so-and-so. All these data are being, I was going to show you a few examples first. Yes. Here we go. Sorry for that. All these data are handled in registers, and registers are really a collection of data, usually grouped after the legal field that they apply to. Real property, for instance, also has to do with taxation. And this is just example. There are many registers in Denmark. We have more than 150 different public sector registers. But we have a handful of what you can call big, huge registers that tells the basic data about our society, such as individuals, businesses, addresses. So what are they used for, these public sector basic data, reference data, whatever we would like to call them? Well, a lot of issues. And this here is an example from Boliga. It's a private company who has launched this independent housing sites and has a lot of people going in there. When they're looking for their dream estate, they can click on a lot of different information and then get a lot of additional information to the housing, all connected to, let's say, the environment. Here, have a look at 3 houses for sale and clicked on the extreme rain scenario. And then you have to choose the better house. And I'm quite sure which house I would buy and which 2 houses I would be a bit reluctant to buy. So combining basic information, public information like background maps, order photos, addresses, and land register information, you get this picture of easily understandable information that very fast can give you an overview of what you would like to know. Another example is the municipality of Odense, together with the water company, has developed this climate ready app. And it uses also basic maps, background maps, and other information, extreme rain information. And they combine it so that you as a citizen can go around in your city, Odense, and take a picture and ask, how will this place be in like a year or 10 years? Is this going to be a lawn still, or is it going to be a swimming pool? And it has had quite a big success, and I think it is being rolled out now to more municipalities than just Odense. So, excuse me for a second. So how does public sector data create value? Well, in Denmark, we freed our public sector data in 2013. And after 5 years, we made an impact analysis. And what we saw was that, of course, open data have an immediate value generation, a turnover, since you do not have to pay for them anymore. Let's say it's the data set addresses. So one data set can be distributed to a whole lot, even the EU via Inspire or the coming PSI directive and high value data, and nationally, internationally, and they hence gain a lot of value because it's used over and over and over again. What we saw when we made the impact analysis after 5 years is that the use has doubled. The number of users actually went bonanza, and the value, the actually calculated money value of open data doubled. This is from 2017, 16-17, this analysis, but we have only seen increase on all parameters. One funny thing that happens when you free your data, which you collect for some other purpose that it is eventually going to be used for when it's open, is this. This is oblique photos, and it was collected to be used for taxation. And we freed it after a couple of years, and we saw really a lot of queries on it. And we went, who is using this data set? I mean, it was only made for taxation. And what we found was, for instance, the window cleaner companies and scaffold companies were using this big time because they could save fuel and time by calculating, estimating time and price on a given task. So they can sit with their computers home in the office and give the customer a price and an estimated time for this. Interesting and very green. What we also saw about the value is that the open data, as we said, yes, they create direct value when they are being disseminated to the end user, but we saw another increase in value is when the private companies come in, take the data, still free and open, they can make business on it if they want to. They create innovation, new solutions, and then they sell them to the end user. So they improve the data with functionality or whatever, and come up with new solutions. Solutions that might not have been if they had to pay for them. So we saw innovation and new solutions actually skyrocketing when we opened up our data. So the private sector is building business on that. But data is not just data, because there are bad data. And using bad data leads to bad decisions. I will not dwell on in how many ways data can be bad. They can be flawed, there can be errors, there can be misspellings, they can be trolled, and so on and so forth. I would like to look at what makes data good, actually. This is more interesting, and this is what we're going to use. So let me start with authoritative data, which I believe, as a concept, are good data. We come back to that. Does always apply. But authoritative data, yeah, well, it's applied from an authoritative source. So long, yeah. You can say that data provided on behalf of the public body, which is an authority, is authoritative data. So you have to have an official mandate, and come back to the first thing about the conditions around the public sector that I spoke about, that you are actually legally mandated and politically controlled to collect this data and provide them for the citizens. I like to say that, well, authoritative data are data that are trustworthy. And you can go, yes, but does that mean that all public sector data are really tip-top good data? And no, it does not. And I think what Torsten also spoke about with the Inspire directive that are built upon public sector data, the answer is no, there's still a long way to go. But it is a pretty good framework for securing trust, and I will come back to that. And you can also go, yes, but what about private sector data then? Are they bad since they're not public? And of course they're not. I mean, we saw a very good example that from Sandra just earlier on, and I have experience of many years of collaboration with the private sector, and there are a lot of really, really high value data out there in the private sector as well. But let's have a look at some characteristics of being a good data. And I know this is subjects that we data nerds can debate for like months, and we will probably never agree fully. There are so many ways of looking at data, but this is my choice. I say data, good data are documented. They are validated by the data provider. They are maintained, so they are as close to real life as possible. They are standardized, meaning that when you get it on a Sunday, it will be the same data you get on you take it on a Tuesday. And they are accessible and they are used. The more data sets are used, the more the quality tends to be heightened. And then there's a very important aspect when we speak about new technology, artificial intelligence and things like that. The traceability and the accountability of data coming from the public sector is, in my opinion, becoming a value that the public sector should look much more into. This is an add-on value that will be important. Back to documented, because I think that is one of the main things. Data should be documented. And how many of you do actually look at the declaration of the goods, the grocery goods you're going to buy? Maybe not all the time, because you have some trusted products you buy every time. But if a new product turns up on the shelf, would you compare with the product that you have trust in? I use it a lot. And I'm very happy that these declarations are actually standardized on an EU level. So I can compare olive oil from Spain with olive oil from Greece, if that's what I want to. And we should demand the same thing of data. They should be declarated, and it should be a standardized declaration. The term in Inspire is metadata. But I think we need to work a little bit about that, because metadata is good when you're a technician. If you're a consumer like me, I just want to be told the plain facts, and I would like to be able to compare them. So where can you find these data? These public sector data. This here is a picture just for my agency, and there are other portals. What is important is these small pictures here where the declaration is. You can unfold them, and you can have the quality and the means they're distributed, who's responsible, how often they're maintained, and so on and so forth. It's all declared there. This is my data declaration. But what I see in a very important EU initiative is in the Open Data Directive, where every member state shall have this national portal containing information and maybe access also to public sector data, because many users need this collected overview, and so they don't have to deal with like 3, 4, 5, 6 different portals, thematic portals. And the Inspire Geo portal is a European collected portal that actually mirrors all the member states' Inspire data that are made available. And I just checked the time. Yeah. So data-driven, with all these good data coming from the public sector and the private. Well, I just made an internet search, and you see there is a lot of going on data-driven sustainability. So it is a thing, and it is something that we should really care about, what data we put into the data-driven. If I look at the public sector just a few years ahead, well, I don't know if it's a trend, but I think it is. But it is my hope that the public sector generally will become more open, hence letting data get out there, accessible, but also open in a way that it will be more user-driven. Not only collect data solely for the purpose of complying with the law, but also thinking about the usage afterwards. More accessible, meaning that it should be easier to retrieve the data via IPAs, for instance, and then combinable, also called interoperable and other things. But this, that you can combine data. We saw in my example this of combining background maps with the information about real estate and weather information is so important to retrieve. Then I think that the public sector in general could be a carrier of EU values. This about democratic, the protection of personal data and the transparency and all that. It's very important, and the public sector is a carrier of these values. And it also a trust enabler, what I said before about the traceability and the accountability. You need to trust the data in order to trust the digital services and solutions that are being made. And then I hope for more collaboration and less supply. We need to change the way we work in the public sector to be more co-creative and innovative, and having the dare to fail a bit. Maybe not when we tax people, but we can do them in separate sandbox rooms and do it together with the citizens and do it together with the private sector to include and facilitate that we actually get the job done. And then my hope, future project, please, EU, label good data like we label bioecological food. Let's have a label system that are certified and trustable, so that we know which data are being used for instance, artificial intelligence. And I will end my speech here with a quotation from Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, and permit myself to say, yes, I do agree, but with good and trustworthy data, please. And that was all for me. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, many thanks for that. And also for you, there are some questions, of course. The first one is about the affordability of data harvesting, processing, and warehousing tools. So which would you recommend for tasks intended for public sector engagement? And how can you actually create economies of scale? Because I see often that's departments of the same organization buy different tools. And so what are your thoughts about it?
Well, I can say with an example of the Danish public sector, we are actually being governed in the way of what we are buying. So we are trying to pool our resources and economy so that we do not just hit the shelves and buy whatever. So there is a regulation from the Ministry of Finance on what the public sector can actually buy on an overall basis. And then what you address, Ivo, is quite true. It happens, of course, in the private sectors as well, that you do that. But here it is so important that we have the standardization and even the EU programs such as Inspire, but also the high value data sets that actually forces, you can say, the public sector to deliver data in a certain format and using standardized web services or APIs.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, you already touched upon the issue of data quality and completeness, and there were earlier questions on that. So you launched this idea of a data label across data sets. More in general, how do we guarantee data quality in these huge data sets? Is there anything beyond the label?
Yeah, there must be more things beyond the label, I think. A label could be a good, quick way of kind of sorting data. But when we're speaking about pooling a lot of data, combining a lot of data, they come with different data quality. And we know that you can have 10 data sets with very high data quality, and then you put one that has a low data quality, and your output will be low. Because this is unfortunately how it is. So it is important, especially when you do these combined services with a lot of different data, that we have some kind of at least documentation, a description of it.
Okay, thanks for that. And then the third question is about robust citizen science. And earlier in the questions, there was also something on citizen science. So what percentage of policy making is derived currently from robust citizen science research, and also ensuring a targeted approach, especially for the SDG national global goals? So how could we better use and harness citizen science in this context?
Yeah, this is something that I personally would like to see much more enhanced in the public sector. The percentage is unfortunately very low. And I think we're dealing with a cultural challenge here, because in the public sector, there is this culture of zero failure, and which is good in many ways, that the public sector, when they tax you or fine you or whatever they do not do it errorsly. But it also prevents the intake of, for instance, citizen science, or even just crowdsourcing on a banal scale. But I think, and Torsten mentioned it, this about digital platforms and ecosystem. If the public sector moved towards that, I think it could be easier to include citizen science, because it will be not all that dangerous and it won't affect our legislation.
Okay, many thanks for that. Now I'm going to take a question that was there before, after my own presentation on Gaia X. So what I presented, how did all of that relate to Gaia X? And I would like to say to that Gaia X is one of the key private sector initiatives on data sharing and data availability, with a lot of work on infrastructures, soft and hard infrastructures for data sharing. And it's very good that the private sector is mobilized in this area. It really shows that the concerns in our policies are fully shared by the private sector. So the data strategy and implementing the data strategy is not just a public sector driven initiative. It's great that this can be both the public and the private sector that are driving it. Now, we need to move together as public and private sectors towards creating the common European data spaces. And of course, there will be differences in terms of the involvement of the public sector or the private sector, depending on the sector. If you've got a health data space, there naturally you would have a stronger public sector oversight than if you talk about the manufacturing data space that will be more private sector driven. So we have to look data space by data space, what is the involvement of the public and the private sector in building the data infrastructures and financing it, and also in terms of the governance models. Then there was another interesting question I would like to ask to the three of you. And it's how we can create more data literacy on the stakeholder side, and especially citizens and public institutions. How can we make that happen? So let's start with Sandra.
It's a really good question and a super tough one. And this I remember from my years at the public sector. I know we were actually thinking about the pilot on how to take so-called data stewards into public sector offices. So even just one person for a pilot, they would create internal hackathons to show what kind of data could be deployed, what kind of use cases could be deployed with this data, and just to make more sense of the data, right? So of course, I mean, this human resources opportunity is always a case, but it could also be just the time for new companies to come in to help filter this data coming in from private sector, and making it edible or understandable for the public sector. So there are different types of software already available for this as well. But yeah, these are some of the ideas.
Okay, many thanks. Then the same question to Thorsten.
Yeah, I said it's a really challenging thing. So I've personally been very interested in the whole climate change topic for a long time, and I've been discussing the observations and data that exist there with a wide range of people for more than 20 years by now. And my experience is that, yeah, data literacy is really an issue overall. And usually the only thing that helps is really to start at the basics. So basically ask people under what conditions would they trust a data set, then show them how the data was collected, then under what conditions would they start to trust the processing, and each follow-up step basically. So it's quite a curriculum. There's no technical solution really to that. There is just taking people by a hand and really walking them through what has actually happened. Like, for example, the fact that it's actually normal that you process data in different ways, and for example, you throw out records that are erroneous and so on. And it's not all because we are all evil overlords who want to manipulate the world with our data or something. So, yeah, I think it's really something that probably should play a larger role already in education, certainly in tertiary level. But generally speaking, it's not something where I see an easy solution. There's just so many traps in understanding and working with data, even for professionals, that for the public and for broad groups of stakeholders, it probably will remain a challenge for quite a long time. That being said, of course, really trusting each other would be a good start.
That's always a good start, instead of thinking of dark data overlords, as you put it. Okay, Ulla, you have the last word on this one.
Yes. So it's so important. Yeah, it is so important. I came to think about when I was a kid, I was being taught how to conduct myself in the traffic. And I did the same thing with my daughter when she started biking around the city. And it's just something you do, and you teach them also to conduct themselves in a school class and whatever. So I think there's something there that since it is a resource that we use every day without thinking about it, maybe we should think about it as a resource that we use every day without thinking about it, and have it start with the schools. And then demand it. As a data user, demand that data is declared. You wouldn't buy a sausage if you didn't know what was in it, I claim.
Okay. Yeah, perhaps you don't want to know how the data are made, like the sausage, but okay, that's that analogy. I would like to thank you very much, Sandra, Thorsten, and Ulla, for these fantastic contributions. And I'm going to hand over again to Elias.
Thank you, everybody, for excellent speeches and question and answer. I just wanted to give you a couple more information about the Connect University. First of all, thanks to all 600 plus of you that are listening to live now. But please know that you still can register. Anybody can register for the sessions that are coming up in the next 2 weeks. The data session is not by chance that is the first day, because that underpins everything, as we said in the beginning. And we will entertain many different topics that could be of your personal interest or your business interest around AI, blockchain, high-performance computing, modeling simulation with the destination Earth. We will have a lot of sessions about the personal and people's involvement, and we will touch upon the trust, misinformation, and the trust of people, because as you know, people trust people. So not just a system or some kind of a sterile way of doing things. So even when we really want quality in data, we have to create the governance so people trust the people behind the whole process. And there we still have a way to go, plus the education which underpins any societal challenge, of course. So the people's involvement and education and basically trust creation is underpinning many of the things we will be talking about throughout the next 2 weeks. So please do register. There is one special diploma, Connect University diploma, that we can give to those that have followed 7 out of the 16 sessions. I know it's challenging, but the diploma, as I said, Connect University is becoming a brand. We already had 5 summer schools. We have already had 150,000 participants. This is the place to come when you really want to see the latest that we do on European scale and beyond, on worldwide scale, on digital technologies. So please do engage. Another thing is that always keep open your Slido with the session hashtag, and you can actually interact by asking questions or interacting between yourself as participants. Now, I would like to close here, unless some of the speakers would have an urgent comment just to close the session with something that you want to leave like a take-home message. Sandra, I would like to say congratulations to Bolt, that is actually a member of a newly established European Green Digital Coalition. So Sandra, thanks to you and your CEO. So we have Bolt on board together with other 29 big companies working on quantifying the effects of digitalization on environment, because at the moment, it's still kind of opinions war. And we have one opinion that says digital is very bad for the environment, other that is the solution for the environment. So we're actually trying with this European Green Digital Coalition to quantify the net effect. What is the footprint? What is enablement? Subtract those two. So this is just the last 2 words on that, but I would leave the floor again to the speakers if they would like to make a last kind of take-home message comments that you'd like to leave. Sandra?
Be sustainable.
That's good. Now the question is how, and whom do we trust? How?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people want to. I mean, this is an experience that we have working in this space. A lot of people want to be green. And that's where digitalization comes, to give them a data to support their choice, not nudging them to change their behavior, but to give them information to support them in their choice. So and many of them, especially young people, do not care about owning a car. They do want mobility service. And if we can provide the footprint of their living in a way, the way they travel, the way they live, the way they eat, I think that would underpin a lot of those choices to actually go in the right direction. So that's a good one. Next would be Thorsten.
Yeah, I would say assume that you can actually work together to solve the big challenges.
Assume, and that's very difficult when you go across disciplinary. Just imagine the academic world, how difficult it is to go from your own vertical and your publishing kind of route to look around. So the cross-disciplinarity is the only way to go when you deal with the real problems. You have to go across different silos, but it's still challenging to govern the governance of that, and recognition of that for everybody. But I think that's where the private sector and public sector creating public-private partnerships on this kind of real problems is happening. So we see a lot of good examples on national and international scene. And Ulla?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just came to think about that EU regulation actually paves the way for trusted innovation. I mean, when the GDPR came up, everybody said, oh no, another hindrance, but we have come to embrace it, and seeing that trust in data applying to GDPR used trifold.
Yes, very good. And that's a good point. Can we replicate the success of GDPR also on what we would call kind of a green digital, not regulation, but some kind of a framework for people to work within? And first of all, we would actually need to agree on the method of calculating the benefits. And that's where a lot of the things break their teeth, because we know that digitalization has to serve economy, society, environment. We don't have ways to measure that contribution. We have kind of bad measures on economy, how much we push with GDP, but normally these type of measures are against or work against the environment. So it's on the expense of the environment to push the GDP. We are struggling still with the social measures. So we have some things about inequalities and skills and digital gap, and we getting there on the social, but on the environment, we are completely new kids on the block, and we need a help. And that's why the coalition, European Green Digital Coalition, is there. But ultimately, and that's why it's kind of Prime Minister's office job, it's not one minister at a time, to see that three-dimensional space and say, I will use ICT to progress on all three dimensions. And I will not allow that one dimension does something on expense of the other. That is not easy message. And the policymakers still live in their silos, those that look at economy, those that look at social issues, labor issues, and those that look at environment. And that's difficult to bring them in the same room and understand that they all go together to progress. And data is the only thing that will make them talk. The evidence and data is on the table, the only way to bring them together to actually agree on this triple win. So thanks for bringing it up. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. And this closes the second session of the Connect University. Thank you everybody again. Just to remind you, we have every day session 10 to 12, 2 to 4. Please look at the program, look at the special hashtag for the Slido. Do register, you can register anytime. There is also a YouTube channel, and join, as I said, 9,000 people from 70 countries that already registered to benefit from this Connect University Summer School. Thank you very much.